Hey everyone, it's Sokka here, coming at you with a card review for the Midnight Sun Netrunner booster pack. Looking forward to doing these as my first one, and there's going to be a lot of hopefully good insights for everybody, and also I'm going to be doing a lot of deck ideas. So yeah, I'll be showing off a couple deck lists that I've played, a couple deck lists that I've theory crafted, and yeah, hopefully those will be some things that everybody will see in the future, either myself play or other people in the community. So I'm just going to jump right in here. We've got 7 cards for the corpse side, 3 for the runner, and yeah, we'll just go in the order that they appear. So the first one's Light the Fire. It's a 1-cost Anarch resource worth 2 influence, and it says for a click and trash a card, the card, and to suffer 1 brain damage, you run a remote server, and during that run, cards in the root of the attacked server lose all abilities. When that run is successful, trash all cards in the root of the attacked server. So the first thing that comes to mind when looking at this card is that it addresses Skunk Void. So this has been a combo for those unfamiliar who that's been, kind of dominating remote play in the Netrunner scene in terms of building a remote and being able to protect it. This is like the best way that we've almost ever seen. I don't know if Caprice is better even. This is probably even better than Caprice. So yeah, Light the Fire is a very direct way of being able to counter this. I'm very happy that such a card like this exists, because before, when you ran into Skunk and when you ran into Void, you really had to spend a ton of money, which was usually not worth it, just to get the corp to trigger Void, or you had to install Political Operative, which was fine, but you can counter that by maybe putting 2 Voids in the remote, putting Crisium Grid on HQ, protecting HQ. So it was a big ask to get rid of Skunk Void, and this is like a very, very obvious counter to it, and I love that it exists. I know that some people might think that like suffering a brain damage is not. It's too easy to use, because, as we may know, Stim Hack was a card, and Stim Hack. Oh, I misspelt it. Stim Hack lets you make a run, and you get 9 credits for that run, and the only cost of playing a card, in addition to spending a click, is having to take a brain damage at the end of the run. And that wasn't really that big of a cost when you have such a good ability as gain 9 credits. And I think in the case of Light the Fire, it's definitely a really, really strong ability. But just how powerful Skunk Void is, I don't mind. I like that it's able to counter that, and just based off of that, I like the card. There's some other things that we should talk about, though, for Light the Fire. One way to counter Light the Fire is to put Border Control on your remote. So if you're playing PD, you usually have like 1 or 2 copies of Border Control in your deck. So what you can do to counter Light the Fire is you play Skunk Void into your remote, and you put Border Control on there. So when they trigger Light the Fire and they take a brain damage and they trash the card and they make a run, you can res and pop your Border Control, and now they don't have Light the Fire's ability. While this is a way of countering Light the Fire, I would say that it's not that easy to do. And what I mean by that is this. It is easy to take a Border Control and install it in the remote because you already have it in the deck, sure. But if you actually consider PD's playstyle, or like any deck that has Skunk Void in the deck, you usually, once you have Skunk Void set up, Border Control is not for the remote anymore, right? Because Skunk Void locks down your remote. You just need like 1 or 2 semi-taxing pieces of ice, and you're good enough, and they're not going to run the remote. So now Border Control usually goes in HQ, goes in R&D, depending on where the threats are, right? If they have Stargate, you might put Border Control in R&D. And usually when you do put Border Control on a remote and you're a Skunk Void deck, you usually put it there before you had Skunk Void in that remote. So it was like the first solution to locking down the remote, and then later you transition into Skunk Void and Border Control is not needed, and usually it doesn't get popped. So unless that happens, in which case that's just the way that the cards are drawn. The Corp will actually have to go and take the board control and put on the remote, which is unusual if they have Skunk Void set up in their remote already. So, I don't know. It makes the Corp do something different that they otherwise wouldn't have done, and if anything, that's value in itself. And keep in mind that you have to install this card. You have to pay a credit to install it, and then you have to spend a click and trash it and suffer brain damage for the ability. So just putting it on the board is a big threat. The Corp knows that you have the ability. The Corp will be thinking about it. They'll have to be playing around it. They'll have to do something like pop their Spin Doctors. So this will be something that people will need to be very aware of, especially if you have a Light the Fire installed on the board already. So if you, as a Corp, if you pitch agendas into your archives and then you have a Spin Doctor on the board that's rezzed, or unrezzed for that matter, and the runner uses Light the Fire and runs your Spin Doctor, you can no longer use Spin Doctor's ability to remove Spin Doctor from the game and shuffle 2 cards from archives into R&D. So that's really impactful, because then if that happens, the runner can trash your Spin Doctor and then they can run archives for the agendas, which means that the Corp will probably have to pop their Spin Doctor ahead of time, as long as the runner is threatening to use Light the Fire. Now, if Light the Fire is not already on the board, then the Corp has the option to wait until the runner installs Light the Fire, and then they have to pop Spin Doctor. So that's something for runners as well. If you install Light the Fire and you intend to use it right away, or maybe even if you don't, you should probably install Light the Fire and then give your opponent a chance to use any paid abilities that they want, because it's a very important action window if they have something like Spin Doctor on the board. Okay, next card. Next card we've got Revolver. I guess I have no reason to go back there. So next card we have Revolver. Revolver is a 2-cost, 1 MU, 1 strength criminal icebreaker killer. It breaks sentries, and it is 3 influence, and it says when you install this program, place 6 power counters on it. And the abilities are you can boost 3 strength for 2 credits, and when you get to strength, you can trash Revolver or use a hosted power counter to break 1 sentry subroutine. This card is really good. I wanted to say insane, but I won't do that. But I don't know. I just said it. But yeah, though this card's really good. The one thing that everybody should do when evaluating this card is that you should keep in mind that this card does cost 2 credits and a click to install up front, but you're actually prepaying for the ability to break subroutines. So in a traditional icebreaker, you have to pay credits to break subroutines, right? So subroutines cost credits. When you play breakers such as this, so the other ones are the dog breakers, so that's Lady, Rex, and Cujo. Those 3, and usually it's Lady that's played the most, right? In the case of Lady, we'll just bring that up here. In the case of Lady, you get 4 power counters, and each power counter breaks 2 subroutines. So you're paying $4 up front, and you're breaking 8 subroutines, right? And usually, in like a traditional good icebreaker ratio, 1 credit per sub is the standard. And when you're paying 4 credits to break 8, that's really good. There's the slight downside in Lady is that you have to use 1 counter to break 2 subs. So if there's only 1 sub, or if there's an odd number of subs, you have to use a suboptimal number of hosted power counters. Now, in the case of Revolver, you have 6 counters, and you can use each counter to break 1 sub. So it's better than Lady in that sense, in that you get to break 1 sub per counter, rather than, for example, 3 power counters for 2 subs each, right? So in this case, you're spending 2 credits, you're getting 6 power counters, and you're getting the ability to trash it to break a 7th sub. So you're getting the ability to break 7 sentry subroutines for 2 credits. And that's really good. 2 credits for 3 strength is fine. Usually the gold standard there is 1 credit for 1 strength, but 2 for 3 can be beneficial. It can be worse depending on what sentry you're breaking. So for example, when you say sentry, people usually think of Anansi. So if you have to break a Nanzi, it costs $4 to up strength, and that would get Revolver up to 7 strength, and you only needed 5. But if it was 1-for-1, you'd be paying $4 anyways. So that's fine, right? If you're breaking like a 2 strength sentry, like Veritas, then you'd have to pay $2 for that 1 strength. So yeah, some, 2 for 3 strength can be beneficial, can be not, depending on the situation. But I would say 2 for 3 strength is generally just fine. And the power counter ability to break subs without having spending money is really, really good. So what can you do with this? Simulchip and Pawn Shop are the 2 that come to mind right away. So Simulchip, you can reinstall your Revolver, you can reload it, put more power counters on it, and it also installs it for free because you pay 3 less. And also Pawn Shop, when you're done using your Revolver, I guess you're never quite done, because Revolver has the ability to trash itself. You can, if you choose not to use the ability to trash itself on Revolver, then you can use Pawn Shop to pawn it for 3 credits. And that's also pretty good. So I will say that I think Revolver is very much a Shaper card. It's just a very Shaper thing to do, to have a limited use breaker that is, especially with like Simulchip, with the install cost discount, you can install Revolver for free with Simulchip. If you're like running early with an SMC, you want to have something that's very efficient. And as I said, like paying 2 credits to install the icebreaker, and then you can break up to 7 subs for free, is really, really efficient if you're in a situation like that. So yeah, I think this is very much a Shaper card. And I will talk about Criminal. So the Criminal breaker right now, for a while now, has been Begalter for sentries. I think this is very much regarded as like one of, or if not the best killer in the game right now. And a lot of people find it difficult to port it out of Criminal because it's 4 influence. Mind you, Revolver's 3, which is, it's 1 influence cheaper, but it's still, like 3 is a pretty hefty cost still. But again, as Shaper, if you have SMCs and if you have Simulchips, you only need 1 copy of Revolver. Begalter fits Criminal, and it fits what Criminal wants to do. And this is why I say Revolver is very much a Shaper card, because it's not a Criminal card. For you to make a Criminal deck that plays Revolver over Begalter, it needs to synergize somehow with the ability, I guess with the requirement of reinstalling programs. So Simulchip, like I can't really name any off the top of my head right now, but things that recur, right? And usually what criminals do right now is that they mutual favor to get their icebreaker, and they install their icebreaker, and that's like their breaker is down for the rest of the game. So criminals that play like all these early pressure events, play like bravados, inside jaws, boomerangs. Their deck is full of high power events, and high power like pressure cards, and you want to try to get to the late game stage where you've kept the corp down, and now you're going to use mutual favor, you're going to use your ability to find cards with Class Act, and you're going to install a rig that consists of Begalter, Amina, or Unity for your Code Gate breaker, and Paperclip for your barrier breaker. So now you've got 3 breakers down, and as long as you have money, you can break ice for the rest of the game. And Revolver has a limited use, so that doesn't really fit into what Criminal does right now. And I would say I would be very surprised if a deck comes up where Revolver fits in a Criminal deck, like a good competitive Criminal deck, where it makes sense to play Revolver over Begalter. So yeah, I think Revolver is very much a Shaper card. I will say though that there is synergy with Tapworm in faction and Criminal. So if we do come up with some kind of program recursion Criminal that is good and consistent, if we play Revolver as the killer, we probably throw in some Tapworms in there, because if recurring programs is what we're doing, this is a very nice program to be recurring, right? Okay. Next card is Deep Dive. So Deep Dive is a 2-cost Shaper event that's worth 5 influence, and it says play only if you made a successful run on HQ, R&D, and Archives this turn. And the ability is the Corp must set aside the top 8 cards of R&D face up. So that means both players get to see what those top 8 cards are. And then the runner gets to access one of those cards, and the runner can spend a click to access another one of those cards. And then the Corp shuffles the set aside cards into R&D. So a lot to unpack here. It's worth noting right away that you can only spend a click once. So the maximum number of cards that you can access out of the 8 is 2 cards. But yeah, so this card requires a run on HQ, R&D, and Archives. So what are some ways to make this work just right off the gate? So Out of the Ashes is the in-faction one. I guess is the in-faction commonly known one. I'll get to the other one in a second. But Out of the Ashes, we've seen played out of APOC decks. You throw it in the bin, and then you can use it at the start of your turn by removing it from the game and making a run. It's a very easy way to make things work. It's very easy to just throw a card in the bin, such as Out of the Ashes, especially with something like Arcation, where you are incentivized to play it as your last click. So drawing 4 cards as your last click and not having to discard is uncommon, I would say, compared to having to discard. So having stuff like Out of the Ashes in your deck and playing Arcation and discarding Out of the Ashes or discarding Paperclip is very nice. The one downside of this, though, is that when you use Out of the Ashes, and if your opponent knows you're on Deep Dive, it kind of gives away what you're doing that turn, because unless you have another reason, and there's very few reasons to be using Out of the Ashes, right? Unless it's like a really important turn, or you think it's the last turn of the game, you might use Out of the Ashes, but if your opponent knows you have Deep Dive in the deck, and you play Out of the Ashes at the start of your turn, it's a pretty big giveaway. And the other thing is that this can only be used once per copy of Out of the Ashes you have, right? So if you have 1 copy discarded, you remove from the game, you tell your opponent basically that your plan is to play Deep Dive this turn, and they mess you up somehow by like popping Biovault, popping Border Control, something of the like, or maybe like Vladisibirsk Grid, then you don't have Out of the Ashes anymore, and you can't really play your Deep Dive with an extra click to use that extra ability on there to access a second card. So what can you do? This is something that I was thinking of, that hopefully this card makes a return. It's still really early, and this might be something that I'll try, but I think Temple of the Liberated Mind might be okay in a Deep Dive deck, because you spend a click and you place a power counter on Temple of Liberated Mind, and you can spend a hosted power counter on it to gain a click, and you can only use it on your turn and only once per turn. This doesn't make you commit to using the ability, if that makes sense. And also it stays around, right? This is a card that you install, so you can use it again next turn, use it again the turn after. But if we take a look at Out of the Ashes, this card goes away, right? And we have to use this at the start of the turn. Whereas Temple of Liberated Mind, we can use as late as possible. So we can run HQ, run R&D, run Archives, and then only if those 3 runs are successful, we could pop a power counter off of Temple of Liberated Mind. So now we have 2 clicks. Then we can play Deep Dive, and we'll have an extra click left. So that seems really neat. Obviously, there's cards in Shaper like Beth, which can get you an extra click if the corp has 15 or more credits. So, and this 1 copy of Beth should be in every Shaper deck. So it might just be good enough by just playing Deep Dive without the extra ability, and in the times where Beth gives you an extra click, then you have the extra ability, and that might be good enough. But I'd be interested to see if we can make Temple Liberated Mind work. Other ways to make it work, we've amped up in Anarch, and we have something like Swift out of Criminal. There's some like other ways of making it work too, But I think those are the main ways. And I wanted to talk about what kind of role Deep Dive plays in a deck. So Deep Dive plays as like kind of like a finisher, right? And it's similar in a sense to Hushuk. In you want to be set up in a position where, in the case of Deep Dive, you can run HQ R&D and archives, right? And in the case of Hushuk, you want to be set up in a position to run R&D while having preferably 6 cards installed with a cost that match greater than 0. So it's like a late game card. You can argue that you can play Deep Dive early. So if the Corp, installs Rashida and installs a Piece of Ice turn 1 and plays a hedge fund or something, you can just Deep Dive turn 1. That's fine. Run HQ, run R&D, run archives, pay 2 credits, play Deep Dive. So you end the turn on 3 credits. And you probably steal at least one agenda off the top 8 cards, and maybe if you're lucky enough, you'll pick one off the top of R&D or random one in HQ. Although that would be unlikely because the Corp, didn't protect HQ, so there's probably nothing in there. Yeah, so I would say like Deep Dive is like a late game card, similar to how Hushuk is. But the problem is that I would say the problem with Hushuk and Deep Dive is that these are both finisher cards that do nothing early. Aside from that case where I just described with Deep Dive, where maybe there's no ice and you play turn 1. But it's a finisher card that does nothing early, and that can be a problem because if you're trying to set up for this huge late game situation where you're in total control and you can run places and you want to set up for the ability to run HQ R&D and archives this turn in one turn, right? And if you have like too many copies of Deep Dive and Hushuk and you draw them early, then they're just clogging up your hand. And what that does is 2 things. You're drawing dead cards. And drawing dead cards means that you actually are playing with brain damage because you have cards that you don't want to discard. And you want to find different cards. So that means you're kind of forced to play with 1 less or 2 less or even 3 less hand size because you're holding these cards that you're trying to use in the late game. So to compare what I'm talking about, if we look at something like indexing, we can play indexing pretty much at any point in the game because it costs 0. So like Deep Dive requires us to invest 3 clicks running centrals and 2 credits, where indexing we can just play, look at the top 5 cards, rearrange them, maybe go back and get them. We can play this on turn 1, turn 2, any turn of the game, right? And it's super easy to use. You were just running R&D. There are things that can mess it up, like in the past we've had Jackson. There's Spin Doctor, but in general, it's a very easy card to use that we don't have to set up for that much. That's what makes indexing such a good closer. Another example that I want to pull up is Turning Wheel. Turning Wheel is good early, late, and in the mid game. It's just good whatever stage of the game the game is in usually. And that's because we can build Turning Wheel counters through pressuring centrals. And that's just a good thing to do. So it's an easy thing to just slap onto the board. We don't have to hold on to it. We don't have to play with pseudo brain damage. And again, like it's just really easy to use. And it's also really threatening because having the ability to use power counters for additional accesses is really good. So it's a really flexible mid-game, late-game power card. So if we think about Deep Dive, we really have to set up for this late game ability to look at the top 8 cards and access 1 or 2. And the requirement of having to run 3 centrals is similar to Apocalypse, right? So the question is it better than Apocalypse? And the answer is that they're both different decks, because if you're setting up to Deep Dive, you're setting up to control the board and you want to maintain control of the board, so you probably have like a lot of things installed, whereas like when you're playing an APOC deck you probably don't have too many things installed. But I would say APOC is better because the second thing that I just described, where we don't have too many things installed and we're still trying to make a run on HQ R&D and archives, when we blow up the board, we're able to kind of like take advantage of that because it's now later in the game, and the way that agenda density works, single accesses are now more valuable. Whereas if deep dive is just something that it just seems, it in that sense it's like nicely balanced, because it's bad early, just like Hushuk, it's bad early, right? And then it gets a lot better later in the game, but at the same time, when you get later into the game and you're not trying to blow up the board like APOC, when the Corp sets up taxing ice on HQ R&D and archives, which if the game is going late, that's what they should be doing, unless they've got some other threat. If they have taxing ice on HQ R&D and archives, it's probably costing you a lot of money to get in there. So you really want to have other things that enable these runs to happen. So like I'll say feint, but feint is not a legal card. So something like this, something like Inside Job, which is out of faction. Dirty Laundry, I guess, is a very, very easy one to throw out there. So you want something to kind of like enable these runs, because otherwise I would say like just removing the ice is a lot better. I will say that like Deep Dive is good in the sense if you're against fast event decks, because being able to dig for 8 is really important, especially if you're playing a Shaper deck with no Clot. But you should probably be playing a Shaper deck with Clot, and I'll go into that in a second, or near the end of the video. But yeah, I think Deep Dive is great in that situation when you're playing against fast events, because if you have APOC, removing ice is great, but you're kind of still stuck in the single axis mode. So now let's bring together what I just talked about with Revolver and Deep Dive. Cutlattery is something that I believe it's on the front page of NetRunner right now. I've made some of my own edits to this deck. I think this deck is pretty good. I love the idea of using Harmony Air Therapy to cycle Ice Destruction for Shaper. And as I said, Revolver's a great Sentry Breaker for Shaper. And then you got one copy of Deep Dive in there, one copy of Conduit. So the ability to just use Conduit, and then you can use Deep Dive to shuffle R&D, and then you can Conduit again. Seems pretty good. And also remember that as I mentioned before, Revolver, $2 to break up to 7 subroutines, is a really good trade-off. And when you're using those, the ability to break to trash the ice with Fork, Knifed, and Spooned with Palangi seems really good. And it synergizes really well naturally with Revolver and the Cutlery. So I love this. I love this deck idea. The other one is like a Congress-style deck. So this one you play like really late game. You've got Rozekis. Notice the other deck didn't have Rozekis. So you sit around with like hitting Proco, installing Rozekis, getting a lot of drip, using Mayfly to contest remotes, using Falsify to contest remotes, and then you're kind of like closing out the game with Eliash's Deep Dive and maybe a Beth Click. And this deck is a lot more control-oriented. So you've got Light the Fire, you've got Polyp in there to deal with Skunk Void, or to deal with other things like Rashida and maybe Sanzans. And as I said, this is a great Breaker Suite, Paperclip Revolver Unity. I love that. Okay, moving on to the Corp cards. The first one's Hakarl. Hakarl is a 5 res 4 strength HB barrier, and it's 3 influence, and it says when you res this ice during a run against this server, you may de-res another installed card. If you do, the runner cannot use paid abilities printed on Borrowed Ice for the remainder of this turn. And you can lose a click to break 1 subroutine on this ice. Only the runner can use the ability, and the 2 subs are do 1 brain damage and the run. I'll start by saying this second part, if you do, the runner cannot use paid ability printed on Borrowed Ice for the remainder of this turn. This ability is fine. Like it's a good thing for the Corp, I guess, but usually runners are not relying on the ability to spend clicks to break subs. So this ability isn't actually that great. But the option to de-res something is what makes this piece of ice very interesting. Because it says you may de-res. So this is not technically a cost. If it says you must de-res, then you can see it as like a cost. But it says you may de-res. So what kind of cards do we want to de-res? So the first one's Spin Doctor. You can de-res the Spin Doctor, which lets you res it again. And when you res this asset, you draw 2 cards. So you basically get a free 2 cards, right? I will mention this, I forgot to right at the start, is that when you res Hakarl, when you have the option to res Hakarl, you also have a paid ability to res other things. So if you have a Spin Doctor that's currently unresed, you can res the Spin Doctor and then res Hakarl, which can de-res the Spin Doctor, which will give you the ability to res the Spin Doctor again. So that's an interesting use. Other things that you might want to de-res is Nico Campaign. So when you res it, you get $9 onto the Nico Campaign. So maybe you have one resed already, or again, maybe you don't. And it can essentially mean the Nico Campaign will pay out 18 credits instead of 9. Or it will mean that it'll just have a really big target on its back and the runner will really want to run it. Yeah, so this is just a page where I just searched up when you res. So these are all the corp cards that trigger when you res it. So a couple notable ones in here would be like Elizabeth Mills. You can remove bad publicity, although I don't think this is legal. No, it's not. Like Lily Lockwell, which I think is also not. It is legal, but Malia wouldn't work. I guess you could recycle Malia. So if you used Malia on something and now that something is gone, reduced service is something that you can reset. And like stuff like Ping and Anemone, which is the next card we'll talk about, is something that you can de-res as well. And also Regolith is a decent one. You can reset it. You can load another $15. So yeah, this is an interesting card. Some combos that we can do here, and I'll get into those after talking about the next card. So the next card is Anemone. Anemone is a 3-res, 2 strength, Jinteki sentry that's worth 2 influence, and it says when you res this ice during a run against this server, you may trash one card from HQ to do 2 net damage. And it's got a single sub that says do 1 net. So I'd say there's 2 archetypes. There's 2 obvious archetypes that this synergizes with. So the first one would be kind of like a dirtily grinder deck. So you can use Anemone as, you can install it as a piece of ice, and then when the runner runs, you can res it, trash a card out of your hand, do 2 net damage, and then you can install an ice over top of it, trash the Anemone, and then you can like preemptive it back and reinstall it later. So that's one use. I think the other use, which is better, more, it just synergizes a lot better, is the use with Obokata. So Obokata and Kakugo together means that you've got a basis for a very, very good Jinteki Glacier. So Obokata costs 4 net to steal. Kakugo does another damage. So when you can have a remote with Kakugo Anemone there. Anemone unresed. Kakugo can be resed or not. And then when you jam the Obo, that'll be the turn where you res the Anemone. And, you'll get 2 net damage from here, 1 net damage from the Kakugo, assuming you have 1, which means that it costs the runner. They need to have 7 cards in hand in order to come all the way in and steal this Obokata. Not to mention you can stack it with other things. Now, usually in decks like these, they would play Data Loop. Data Loop is also a 2-card effect. The runner doesn't lose the 2 cards. Instead, they add 2 cards back on top of their stack, which is a significantly worse ability if we don't take into account costs. Because what Data Loop lets the runner do is that they can, if they have like 2 cards in hand that's really important to them, they can put it on top of their stack as a way of protecting it. And also they don't lose it, right? So they can draw, they get the cards back, whereas Anemone, they lose it. So we can actually potentially grind them out even though we're playing like Glacier. The other thing about this is that Data Loop costs $7, which has usually been a big cost for Jinteki decks. 7 costs for something that costs Paperclip 3 credits to break is not that great. So you really have to take advantage of this on-encounter effect for Data Loop to be good. And Anemone is just like, it's not that big of an investment compared to 7 credits. So in this case, you pay 3, you trash a card, and you get the effect one time. It is worth mentioning, though, that Data Loop does stay there. The ability remains active, so every time the runner runs back, they have to kind of deal with this, which is can be a big hit on tempo if they have to redraw their cards, right? Okay, here's the fun part. Surratt City Grid. So let's start by saying this. So Hakarl and Anemone says when you res during a run against the server. So you can't do this whenever. They have to be running that server. But here's what Surratt City Grid can let you do. So Surratt City Grid says when you res another card in the route of or protecting the server, you may res a card paying 2 credits less. So this lets you res ice outside of a normal ice resing window, which means that you can res a piece of ice that is not currently being approached. So just picture this. You've got Surratt City Grid in a remote. You've got Hakarl on the inside of the remote. You've got a second copy of Hakarl on the remote, and you've got Anemone on the outside. So from the runner's perspective, it goes Anemone, and then Hakarl, and then Hakarl, and then at the end of the remote, they've got Surratt City Grid. So if the runner runs, okay, you res the Anemone because they're approaching Anemone, right? So you res, you trash a card from HQ, you do 2 net damage. And then you can use Surratt City Grid to res, and you can res Surratt City Grid at that same window too. So you don't have to you don't have to show your hand, if that makes sense, on what's going on. So you res Surratt City Grid, and then you res Hakarl, because Surratt City Grid lets you res another card in the route of or protecting this. You may res 1 card, right? So you can res 1 card, and if you res that 1 card, and that card is in or protecting this server, it triggers itself all over again, right? So you can use Surratt City Grid to res Hakarl, and Hakarl, when you res it against during a run against the server, which is happening, right? They're not approaching Hakarl, but it is during a run against the server. So this ability is still active, or it still triggers. You may de-res another installed card. So we're going to de-res the Anemone that we just resed. All right? We're going to de-res the Anemone that we just resed. And then we're going to trigger Surratt City Grid because we just resed Hakarl. So we just resed Hakarl. So Surratt City Grid is going to let us res a card paying 2 credits less. So we're going to re-res the Anemone, triggering the ability, trashing a card, and doing 2 net damage. So now we've done 4 net damage. And we're going to do the same thing one more time, where we use Surratt City Grid to res the other copy of Hakarl, and then Hakarl will de-res Anemone, and then we'll use Surratt again to re-res the Anemone, triggering it a 3rd time, all in the same action window to deal 6 net damage. Yeah, that's what I got. That seems super wild. That is something that I want to try. But yeah, and you don't have to, again, you don't have to show your hand at all. So the runner's just running this remote. It's got 3 pieces of ice. It's got a card at the bottom of the remote. And suddenly they're taking 6 net damage. And what does this cost you? It costs you $3 to res Anemone, 2 credits to res the Surratt, and then everything else costs 2 less from there on, right? So it costs 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So it costs 8 plus 5 is 13. That's not a ton of money. 13 credits is not a ton of money to be dealing 6 net damage worth of burst. So yeah, I'm expecting to do some kills with that, and hopefully people won't see it coming, even though I'm releasing a video like this, you know. Okay, next card. This is I'm going to try to pronounce it, and I'm only going to try to pronounce it once. It's Vladisibirsk City Grid. I'm just going to call it Vlad Grid because it's just easier that way. So it's a 3 res, 4 trash, upgrade region out of NBN worth 4 influence. And it says you can advance this upgrade, and for 2 hosted advancement counters, you can remove those 2 hosted advancement counters to place 2 advancement counters on another card in the root of the server that you can advance. And you can only use this ability only once per turn. So right off the gate, this is, you can use it to fast advance 4/2s. So Cyberdeck Sandbox, Offworld Office. So you install the Vlad Grid, double advance it, and then another turn later, you can install Sandbox, double advance Sandbox, use the Vlad Grid ability to transfer 2 advancement counters onto here. Now it's at 4, and you can score Offworld or Cyberdecks or any other 4/2 out of hand. So that's great. This synergizes very well with Daily Quest because you can prep the Vlad Grid in the server as an upgrade without having to disrupt Daily Quest. So you get an extra turn or 2 out of Daily Quest that way. It also synergizes well with BioVault. BioVault synergizes with Daily Quest, but also Vlad Grid and BioVault synergize together really well on its own, because what you can do is you can just advance the Vlad Grid and you can just install BioVault. And you don't have to advance the BioVault. So when the runner makes a run and you want to pop BioVault, you can use Vlad Grid because you can use it once per turn, including the runner's turn. So you can use this to move 2 advancement counters onto the BioVault, res the BioVault, pop the BioVault. So that's a really nice synergy here, BioVault with Vlad Grid. Now, here's 2 deck ideas for you, or 3, I don't know. Here's where things can get wild. Okay, so here, this is just the Vault Asmari that I and a couple others took to Worlds. This is not, the things get wild in the next deck, but I just wanted to say here that I think it doesn't quite fit into like Daily Quest decks and NBN, I don't think, because out of Asmari, it's so nice to play 6 agendas. You play 6 5/3s and Echo Chamber. And Vlad Grid synergizes well with 4/2s, so I think this is pretty difficult to make work. I think this deck is already really good, and we don't want to... If we were to change this into 2-pointers, I think this deck gets quite a bit worse. Here's where things get wild. Here's an Egg Infusion deck. Now, notice that I'm at 22 influence because I wanted to show everybody what I want, but we are over influence, so we're going to have to deal with this in some way. But I think this works really well in Jinteki because Jinteki has Sandbox and Nisei, which are both agendas that 4/2s that Jinteki Glacier wants to score, right? So similar thing that we've said, Daily Quest, Vlad Grid, BioVault. We already know about that, right? Now, the other thing that this can do is we can host Divert Power in this deck. Okay, now, Divert Power has been something that I've played around with before out of Egg Infusion. It's good out of Egg Infusion because you can res a big ice, like Anansi, like DNA Tracker, like Chiashi early, and at a discount. And once you get like a big ice res, Egg Infusion ability gets turned on really nicely, and it just synergizes with Egg Infusion really well. But here's what Divert Power lets you do. When you de-res something, it is no longer active. So when you res it again, the ability, the card doesn't remember that it's been used because it's an inactive card that's now become an active card. So what I mean by this is that Vlad Grid says uses ability only once per turn. So if you were to use Vlad Grid, de-res it, and then res it again, you can use it again in the same turn. Okay? So what this means is that we can use that to fast advance Oboe, or other 5/3s for that matter. So we can have 4 advancement tokens on the Vlad Grid, right? And we go click 1, install Oboe, and then we can move 2 counters from Vlad Grid onto Oboe. Click 2, we can divert power to de-res Vlad Grid. And it's interesting because it says de-res any number of cards. You may res a card lowering its res cost by 3 for each card that you de-res this way. So you can just use this to de-res Vlad Grid and then just re-res it for free. Okay? So you re-res it, and now we can move another 2 advancement counters onto Oboe. And that's click 2, and now Oboe's on 4. So click 3, we advance it again, it's on 5, we score. So there's some nice synergies here, right? Also with Anemone, we can de-res that, synergy there as well. Next, I wanted to mention Defense Construct. This is just something that can synergize with Vlad Grid. Is like it's an upgrade that you can use, just like Biovault. It's probably just a meme, but this is an upgrade that can be advanced that you don't have to pre-advance, if that makes sense. So you can just have this in the remote. You don't have to advance it. And then if the runner were to run archives, because it can only be used during run on archives, you can trigger the Vlad Grid, put counters on the defense construct, and trigger the defense construct if triggering defense construct is something you want to do. And finally, as in terms of like ambushes, it's probably not worth it, but it is something worth mentioning, is that you can put something like Urtica Cipher or Cerebral Overrater on there. The Vlad Grid can just host the advancement counters, so it's a trap that you can put in your remote that you don't have to advance, and you basically only advance it if the runner runs. So you put an Urtica Cipher in your remote, they run, they can't, they come in, and then after they choose to access, you can move counters onto the Urtica Cipher, and 2 advancement counters will do 4 net damage off of Urtica. There's other things that are worth mentioning as well, like Daruma would synergize with this. So you can use Daruma to move things into the server to kind of like protect the Vlad Grid. So you can move something like an Urtica or like a Cerebral Overrider in when they approach the server. If you want to score a, what is that card called? It's a project. We're just going to look up project, and it did not come up. What's that card called? There's a 3/2 that Jinteki has, right? We can find it this way, actually. There we go. Project Yagyuda. You can use Project Yagyuda to swap a card from HQ with one card in the root of, or protecting the attacked server. Both cards give the runner ability to jack out, but if they jack out, they don't hit the trap, but you protect your Vlad Grid. So that's the whole point of that whole thing, right? So that seems pretty good. The next thing I wanted to talk about was Seamless Launch. I love this synergy between Seamless Launch and Vlad Grid. So we've talked about scoring 4/2s with this, right? You can fast advance 4/2s. But if you have this installed with no advancements on it, okay, if you just have this card pre-installed, you can use Seamless Launch to fast advance a 3/2. So you can have the Vlad Grid installed, you res it, right? You seamless the Vlad Grid, so now it's got 2 counters. And then you can install your agenda, single advance the agenda, and then we can move the 2 counters from here onto the agenda and score 3/2. Now, I will say that having 3/2s and 4/2s in the deck can seem like you're trying to do a little too much. Like, are you trying to score 3/2s or are you trying to score 4/2s? Because we're investing quite a bit of cards here, right? And probably influence as well. So the most beneficial use case of this, I think, is with 3/2s that have benefits when you over advance them. So something like Project Atlas, like Project Vitruvius, or even Project Yagyuda. You can fast advance them as 3/2s, or if you're not fast advancing them as 3/2s, you can use Seamless Launch, how it's been used classically, or Vlad Grid, like we've been talking about, where you pre-advance it and then you move, and you can score the 3/2s as if they're 4/2s by over advancing them by 1, right? So here's a deck concept for that out of ASA group. So out of ASA, we can have Vlad Grid and we can have Seamless Launch both in the deck, and we can also play Divert Power, which can do the same combo that I talked about earlier, which lets you score a 5/3 out of hand. So in this case, we've got Cyberdeck Sandbox, which is our 4/2, and we can also fast advance Luminal or Project Vitruvius out of hand, or we can score Vitruvius as a 4 advancement requirement and get a Vitruvius counter, which is great for ASA because we can recur stuff like fully operational, right? Which is a very powerful operation for ASA. Now, I haven't completely filled in this deck, but this is just to give a opening deck concept. The combo with Hakarl and Nico Campaign and Spin Doctor is in here, so we can use Hakarl to derez Spin and derez Nico Campaign. And also we can use Divert Power to do the same thing, right? So we can use Divert Power to derez Spin, derez Nico. There's probably also like Rashida's in here, which we can res and derez because it costs 0. And you probably throw like a hedge fund in here, throw some pretty typical HB ice, and we put like some Ansels in here, and this could be something that we could divert power to res if we're not doing the Fast Advance 5-3 combo with the divert power. Just using divert power to maybe derez a Spin, derez a Rashida to res a free Ansel seems pretty good. Last card is Azef Protocol. Now I've already done. I did my last stream on pretty much on Azef Protocol. I'll go over each of those deck lists on here as well. But I'll just start by saying, giving giving Wayland another 3/2 is, to me, that's kind of that's really good. Because now we've got Azef, we've got Atlas, and we've got Above the Law. So Wayland has 7 3/2 agendas. And 7 3/2 agendas is too many 3/2 agendas. Because you can do so many busted things with that. Because you can, Argus is one. So I'll just show that one off right now. Is you have 3 copies of Azef, 3 copies of Atlas, 1 Above the Law, and then you just play like 2 hostile, 2 Oaktowns. Maybe you play 3 hostiles and 1 GFI. Is fine as well. But Argus, you kind of like sneak 3/2s by never advancing, right? Argus's whole game is just never advance. So you set up your ice, you set up things that give tags when they encounter them, and then every single turn you put a card in the server. Sometimes it's a 3/2, sometimes it's a Prysac. And then if it's a Prysac and you don't run, then next turn we'll put something else in the server. Now there's 2 cards in the server. Now is it double Prysac or is it Prysac and an agenda? And you have to be able to deal with the tag or a meat damage. And just having so many 3/2s out of Argus is just so good. Because A, you can never advance so much more because you have 7 of them, right? So it's not just Atlas anymore. You can just install Azefs, you install Atlases, install Above the Law. The meat damage synergizes with Atlas as well. The cost to score trashing one of your installed cards is a significant cost, which makes this card... The card in itself is well balanced. However, I think that there's too many 3/2s in Wayland. But the card itself is very nicely balanced because for you to use Azef Protocol aggressively, meaning really early in the game, trashing a card is a pretty big cost, right? So you want to trash something like maybe a Spin Doctor that you rezzed and you don't need to shuffle 2 cards back. Or maybe it's a IP block or something that the runner has installed a Botulus on. So, or maybe it's a border control that, border control has its own use as well. Like you can just pop it, but maybe you just have a flimsy piece of ice that you have bad pub and they can break through really easily, and you don't plan on backing it up. So yeah, that's what you can do with it out of Argus. Now, this is a deck that we've played already. So this is a build to last deck where we're just using it to rush. So as I said, we've got 7 3/2s. So we've got 3 copies of Audacity, we've got Dedi Rococo combo, and we've got 3 red level clearances and 2 Trickle Lights. So, and we got 3 Spin Doctors, so we can recycle all of that. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? Fast Advance pieces that work on its own. And we've got Dedi Rococo, which I guess is another 3 ways of fast advancing, although the math gets wonky there because you have to have both in your hand at the same time. But let's say you have 8 methods of fast advancing a 3/2. Keep in mind that with red level clearance, you can install your Rococo for an Atlas counter with clicklessly. And you can Spin Doctor to get it back. So you've got 8 copies of ways to fast advance without even taking into account Spin Doctor, shuffling them back. And you've got 7 3/2s. So now there's so many ways that you can just score 3-2s off the board. So you rush early. Maybe you get a hostile takeover scored. Maybe if you get 1 3-2 scored, that means you have to fast advance twice to win the game. Titan in the past has always been like a lottery of whether or not you access Atlas. And Titan, that's what Titan plays off of, is that the fact that there's only 3 Atlases. Titan can use their ability to find the Atlases, because usually you're using Atlas to find the next Atlas, right? And when the runner runs, they are accessing like 1 in 30 cards, 1 in 35 cards, and there's only 2 Atlases in there. And that's just the odds, right? The odds are way against them. If they do find the Atlas, every Atlas that you find against Titan, your odds of winning increase by like 20-30%. And now it's like less of a deal, because we've got 7 3-2s. Before, we only had 3 3-2s. We just had 3 Atlases, right? So now we've got 7 of them. So now it's like, you found a 3-2, that's fine. We've got 6 more, right? You found another one and you got 5 more. We only need to score 3. And of course, New Construction is also a card that we can fast advance. As some of you may know from that stream, I did move over to the outfit. So this is the outfit deck that I played. This is the fully fast advance version of the outfit. I do think this is a bit better than the Built to Last. It does go a little bit slower. You do lose the Trick of Lights. But outfit has a bit more spikier ice in Bulwark and Trebuchet. So you kind of threaten a bit more in that sense. You also have Too Big to Fail to get money very quickly, which means that you can inherently kind of threaten hard-hitting news, even though if you don't have it. So it's a really good in like a closed deck environment if you threaten hard-hitting but you don't actually have it. And here's the recent version of outfit that I've been playing, which is one with hard-hitting news. So pretty much the same thing, right? You got your threats with Bulwark Trebuchet. You've actually got hard-hitting news now with the Consult and a high-profile target. And I've also cut a red level clearance for an arc lockdown, just as for Clot. So you can arc lock down the Clot. I really like this suite of arc lockdown, Consult, 2 hard-hitting, high-profile. You can also put in Econ Warfares in here. Many people argue that it's needed. I would agree in the sense that it's needed if you are trying to kill them. I am not trying to kill them. I'm trying to have a very light tag punishment situation where I'm threatening the fact that I have news. So you need to be aware of the fact that I have it. You need to think twice before you make a run. You should think about how many credits you have. Make sure that you have 8. Make sure that you have some kind of solution for hard hitting. And if you don't, I'll play it. But if you do, it probably slows you down quite a bit. So that's kind of what I'm going for. As I said, you can put Econ Warfares in here. You can cut the Malapert. You can cut like 2 copies of Malapert and cut like a piece of ice maybe, and put in Econ Warfare. You can maybe cut an Audacity if you want to put in 3 copies of Econ Warfare. But yeah, that's something that you can do. I think this is really good. I think that the fact that we have 7 3-2s out of Wayland now means that Fast Advance is really good. And I think that Clot is going to be a very big deal again, just like what happened in Continentals. So yeah, expect to see more Fast Advance, expect to see more Clot. I think that Azef and also Vlad Grid are both Fast Advance enablers. So Clot value goes up a lot. And it's something that we'll have to adjust to. So yeah, that brings us to the end of my review of the Midnight Sun Booster Pack. It did kind of go a bit longer than I expected it to. I will try to do this every single time new cards are released. And yeah, let me know in the comments if there's something you like, something you don't like, something I can do differently. I'll definitely be going through all those. And yeah, until next time, thanks for watching.